Уважаемые коллеги, спасибо большое за терпение и ожидание. Наш переводчик перепутал здание. Я очень надеюсь, что в течение ближайшей пары минут он здесь все-таки окажется, и мы сможем начать. Переводчик уже здесь, да? То есть мы можем начинать, правильно? So Dorothy, I think we can start. So I'll introduce you, say a couple of words, and then let's start. Оксана, мы можем начинать, да? Лекция на 10 поставлена. Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги, еще раз.
Good morning, dear colleagues. Today is the second day of April conference. I'm very glad to see all those who have come in the morning to attend our session. For me, it's a very important day because for the first time during the entire history of the research of education in our country, we are inviting the expert of such level. Please allow me to introduce Dorothy Espelage, professor of Florida University, professor of psychology, a person who is engaged in bullying study and teenagers' aggression. for 22 years. She is the author of more than 200 articles in 6 books and in 70 articles in other books. The person is also well known not only for research, but also for active introduction of the results of this research. And many programs are operating during several years and provide good results. And therefore, I think that today's lecture will be very interesting for all of us. And at the end, we can ask questions and find out something else, if you have any questions. And now,
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm excited. This is my first time. And I am excited to present 25 years of research on bullying prevention in an hour. We started this work in 1993 in the United States. In 1993, there were 5 articles written about bullying in the United States. Currently, in 2019, there are approximately 1,000 articles written about bullying. There's a total of 3,000 articles written worldwide. So we've learned a lot about who are the bullies, why do kids bully, who are the targets of bullying. We've learned a little bit about how to prevent it, but we still have a lot of work to do. When I think about the 25 years of research that we've conducted, what we've learned is it is very difficult to prevent bullying in most of the countries around the world. Some countries do better than others. For example, Finland has been very successful. The United States, Canada, and Australia have failed in many, many ways. What we have learned from across the globe is that there's not a simple answer, that we have to take what we say a comprehensive approach to bullying prevention. When we think about children's well-being, peer victimization, mean and cruel behavior exists all over the globe. And in February 2019, your press covered that 1 out of 4 Russian students have been bullied. So this is a phenomenon that's happening here in Russia, but you're not alone. It's happening all over the world. We do know from meta-analysis, which is a summary of a body of literature, that kids that are victims of bullying have high rates of depression, anxiety, and suicidality. In fact, in many of our countries, adolescent suicide is an epidemic. We also know that when we have school policies and procedures that protect children, when we have social-emotional programming, which we'll talk about more specifically in a little bit, where we're teaching kids how to get along, how to manage conflicts, how to regulate their emotions, then we have improved well-being. We have reduced depression. We have reduced anxiety. And we prevent adolescent suicide. But it's not just the children. For a very long time in our work, we focused on training kids to prevent bullying, but ignored the adults in the schools. And we learned very quickly that the teachers need extensive training in this area, the administrators as well. So you need all of this. You need good policy procedures. You need to teach kids how to manage relationships. And we need to train teachers such that they can intervene when they see bullying so that they can help the targets. When I started this work in 1993, in our 50 states in America, one state had a law against bullying. In 2019, every state in the United States has a law against bullying. America is a diverse country, just like Russia. So in some parts of the country, it's conservative. And bullies go really unnoticed. In other parts of the country, kids feel really safe from bullying. It depends on the policy and the procedure. Without laws, you will not be able to prevent bullying. However, simply having a law will not prevent bullying alone. When we think about the vast literature, the 3,000 articles, we have to think about the well-being of the child. Bullying victimization is one risk for lower well-being. But we have to focus on the prosocial peers. How is it that we have trusting relationships with parents, with teachers? How do we create supportive schools? When we focus on teaching kids prosocial behaviors, when we focus on developing trusting relationships among teachers and students, and parents and schools, then we have higher well-being. We have less victimization over time. Now, of the 3,000 articles that are written on the topic of school bullying, about 400 of them are probably written about the definition. I will probably retire and will still be debating what bullying is. Most of us across the world adopted the definition from Norway. In Norway in the 1960s and 1970s, the pioneer of bullying, Dan Olveus, was talking about whipping boys. And these were boys who were essentially engaging in high rates of bullying, mean and cruel behavior. They would go after the same kids repeatedly. They would go after kids that were less powerful. And when in fact you have a bully that's coming after you and you can't defend yourself, you have high rates of daily interference, depression, anxiety, and lower sense of self-worth. Now, a huge body of the work that we've done, and I have some 250 articles and chapters. As we do our studies, and this is what I would encourage you as you're building research in Russia, bullying does not happen in a vacuum. Bullying is a precursor to other forms of violence. As kids go through their teenage years, as boys and girls try to figure out who they are, who they like, you may find that bullying then leads to what we call gender-based harassment. Now, this topic is always quite sensitive, but you should know that we've shown in longitudinal, rigorous studies that as kids engage in high rates of bullying toward their peers, years later, they also engage in sexual violence. One component of that sexual violence is what we call homophobic name-calling. So we have groups of kids that are at particular risk for victimization. We have students with disabilities that are at risk for victimization, whether they're children with autism, children with attention deficit. But also in our research in the early 2000s, if you're a child that identifies as what we call lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans, you're also the target of bullying at a very, very high rate. And that bullying becomes homophobic in nature. So the minute a boy doesn't act like a boy and masculine, they become a fag or a homo. That then sets the stage for sexual violence. This is not unique to the United States. Homophobic name-calling was discovered in the UK 30 years ago. We only started studying it the last 10 years. This is very hard to study, even in the United States. So this may not be where you want to start your research agenda. Okay, you probably want to start somewhere else. But let me know when you're ready to study this. So in that press release in February, you note that the reporter implicated violence in the home, possibly as a reason for why Russian kids bully. That reporter might have read some of the research, because we do find that family conflict and sibling aggression and domestic violence in the home is associated with engaging in high rates of bullying. So we have to think about the parental component. Again, very challenging. There are only 200 papers written on family violence and bullying. Again, another area, as you're starting your new research program here or continuing it, that you might not want to tackle first, and that's family violence. It's challenging because families don't necessarily want to talk about what's happening in the home. We also find that sexual harassment, violence, then also leads to what we call adolescent relationship aggression or teen dating violence. Again, another area that we've just started studying in the United States as well. This developmental model means that if you're just focusing on bullying and not understanding that it evolves into different forms of aggression, then you'll have limited success in reducing violence across the lifespan. So you can imagine that this is a really complex area of research. We have lots of risk and protective factors. We have moderation. We have explanatory variables. I think the best way to think about prevention of bullying and promoting student well-being is to think about this complexity. What I'm showing you here is Yuri Bronfenbrenner's social ecological model. And so kids that engage in high rates of bullying, or those that are the targets of bullying, get there in different ways. You could have a child who has a disability, say autism, that has difficulty making friends. And when kids cannot make friends and they're rejected by their peers, they're often also victimized through bullying. They're vulnerable. They then become isolated. That only leads to a lower sense of self. Some kids can have autism, but they come from a family in which is very, very supportive. They go to a school where all the kids accept him or her. They're in a neighborhood, in a community that supports that child. That same child may not be bullied. When we think about prevention, we have to think about all the layers that surround our children. We all have individual personalities that vary. You and I might experience bullying, but you're more sensitive to it. It gets under your skin. For me, I could brush it off. That doesn't say anything bad about you. It's just that we're different. So when we think about prevention, we cannot tell each child to manage bullying in the same way. And if anyone has children, you know this. Some of you have children, same mom, same dad, but your one child is completely different than the other. What happened? Personality, genes. We also know that some kids that engage in high rates of bullying may see violence in their home, and others may not. There's a saying, and I'm not sure if you have it in Russia, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. We find that to be true. Sometimes, if you work in a school and a child is identified as a bully, then you meet the child's dad or mom. You have that thought. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. That child, in some ways, has learned that that's how they behaved with their peers. Doesn't make them a bad child. It's just what they know. We also have found support for what's called the homophily hypothesis. We also call it birds of a feather flock together. And this idea is, if I hang out with kids that bully, if I hang out with kids that engage in sexual violence, I will engage in bullying. We also find that if I hang out with kids that talk nice to their parents and do their homework, I will do the same. This is important because when you do bullying prevention, we find that some of the kids that are bullies are popular, that people want to be friends with, especially around ages 10 to 12. Your prevention programs need to recognize that the very kids that are engaging in the bullying may be well liked by teachers and students, and kids will not turn them in. They will get away with their bullying because people fear them. These peers, however, are also quite charismatic, have good leadership skills. So in some of our recent work, we've tried to elicit these kids to help us in our prevention programming. The other layer is schools. Schools vary tremendously in the amount of bullying. The relationships in schools vary. There's a huge body of literature on school climate, school environment. Some say school ethos. Schools are like work environments. Some people get along, other people don't get along. When you think about the prevention, think about the school level. Now, community and society, there's been lots of cross-national comparisons across countries. I come from a country where our bullying rates have increased in the last 2 years. So community, society, politics matter. The kids in our schools emulate what they see the politics doing. Something to think about. Okay, in 2011, which is 8 years old, but there was an update earlier last week on this that supported these findings. If you want to reduce victimization, and this is worldwide, if you want to reduce victimization by 20%, notice I didn't say 100, I said 20. You need disciplinary methods that are non-punitive, meaning that you're not kicking bullies out of the school. You need to train your parents about bullying. Again, very challenging. You need to teach kids cooperative group work. Kids bully less if they really understand the people in the classroom. This meta-analysis actually found do not mediate bullying. Do not put a bully and a victim in a room together. Remember the power differential. What they found is when you do that, the bullying gets worse. If they're friends that are having a conflict, that's okay. But no one wants to sit across from their tormentor. Now, what if you want to reduce bullying perpetration? Look at this list. Again, if you do all of these things, parent training, improved playground supervision, non-punitive disciplinary methods, teach teachers how to manage their classroom, teacher training on bullying, classroom rules, anti-bullying policy, and cooperative group work. Do all that, and you reduce bullying by 20%. That's a lot to ask of our schools. And many schools will not sign on to do this. That should show you that victimization, fewer things you need, perpetration, you need all of this. There's been quite this movement to understand the different types of involvement in bullying. Now, Christina Samavali in 1999 in Finland identified the different roles that kids take: the bully, the victim, the instigator, the bystander. And we've had this bystander revolution across the globe. 60% of kids in schools are standing around watching the bullying. 3% of the time, they're helping the victim. Being a bystander and helping a victim is risky, because the bully may turn on you. The group of bullies, the groups might turn on you. You may lose friends. You may not be invited to the party. And you actually just are fearful for your safety. Younger kids will intervene. By the time they're 10 and 11, they will not intervene unless it's the norm in the school to help victims. Girls intervene more than boys. Students intervene when teachers intervene. Students will intervene when they feel safe at school. We actually find that our prevention programs work very well with the young kids. What you see plotted here is effect sizes. The line starts with first graders. So we're talking about, and this is across the globe, so we're talking about 6-year-olds. As they go through adolescence, our programs are less and less effective. What you do with kids age 7 to age 10 should look very different from age 11 to 16. They're different children, different needs, different school structure. So as I said before, we know that bullying co-occurs with other forms of aggression. It's linked to depression and lower well-being. But we've also started to identify protective factors, the ways in which we can support students and prevent bullying. And one area that has really taken hold across the globe is what's called social emotional learning. I have helped Australia, Israel, Korea, Japan, to name a few countries where social emotional learning is a strategy to prevent bullying, promoting academic functioning, as well as supporting student well-being. So, social emotional learning was developed in 1994 out of a conference that was held in the United States. And it's developed over time, and really it is an international phenomenon. What is social emotional learning? There's different domains. So self-awareness, your ability to accurately recognize your own emotions and thoughts, and how your emotions and thoughts influence your behavior. There's also social awareness. So you can be aware of yourself, but you have to understand how your behavior, your perspective taking, your empathy for others play out. There's also self-management, one's ability to regulate themselves. So when kids get upset, when there's a conflict, when they're struggling with academics, how do they regulate their emotion to calm oneself, to prevent escalation of conflicts? That's self-management. We all need relationship skills. Many of us are successful in our work, in our lives, because we can maintain healthy relationships. How do you do that? You communicate, you listen, you support. So some people will argue across the world that social emotional learning is soft, non-cognitive. We have those words, soft skills. If I were to ask you what skills you need to be successful in your job, many of you would name social emotional learning skills. You would say patience, organization, listening. If you're religious, you might say prayer. I've never had a math teacher answer that question saying quantitative literacy. Any teacher, they name social emotional learning skills. So when people say it's soft, and you need to recognize that that will be an issue in Russia, it is in the United States, that somehow, if we're teaching kids these skills, that is brainwashing, or that's too soft, kumbaya. But every one of us in the room need to have a booster of our social emotional learning skills from time to time. But it's also responsible decision making. For those of you that are parents, you talk to your kids about the decisions that they make that may affect their academics as well as their social trajectory. These 5 social emotional learning competencies, I encourage you to go to the CASEL website, lots of information there, are really critical to both the academic and social functioning of our children. If you don't believe me, you can look to the 2017 meta-analysis. This was 82 school-based studies. And they found longitudinal positive effects when kids are exposed to social emotional learning, whether that's a classroom curriculum, whether it's an after-school program, whether it's an arts program, whether it's a music program. How many of our kids actually develop social emotional learning through the arts? Right? We hear it all the time. Many kids that are victimized, they write poetry. They listen to music. They understand their self, their social space through arts. When you're exposed to social emotional learning versus not being exposed, when you're exposed, you have greater positive youth development, including pro-social behavior. Now, I also want you to understand that we've found that exposure to social emotional learning has long-term impact. So if you can control yourself as a child, it's predictive of adult outcomes, of physical health, less crime, less substance use. Stephanie Jones, who was at this conference, has found statistically significant associations with a teacher saying, you have great SEL skills. And then years later, you have better education outcomes, better employment, less criminal activity, less substance use, and less mental health challenges. Now that's beautiful data, right? Who wouldn't want their child exposed to social emotional learning if we can prevent and promote these outcomes? I could go on and on here. That social emotional learning curriculum, social competence, behavior regulation. If you know effect sizes, 0.2 to 0.4 is a beautiful effect size. It's real. Mindfulness is also something that is an offshoot of social emotional learning. Some of you may know mindfulness as deep belly breathing and being in your space. Because we have some unregulated children in our classrooms that may come from homes where they're experiencing trauma or neglect, we're using mindfulness a lot in the classroom to calm our kids so they can learn. When we do that, there's a 25% increase in pro-social behavior, 15% increase in math achievement, 20% increase in self-reported well-being, and your peers say you're less aggressive. Again, very impressive body of literature. I guess in some ways, as you push forward in understanding bullying, and if there's pushback, social emotional learning may be the way to talk about bullying prevention. It's my gift to you, yes. It was worth the long trip. This meta-analysis is 213 programs. Also found improved social emotional learning skills, higher academic performance, and generally improved students' attitudes and behaviors. So does social emotional learning work for bullying and sexual violence and cyberbullying, which we'll be talking about more tomorrow? So this was a randomized clinical trial that we conducted in 36 schools. This was middle school, so it would be ages 10 to 13. This is really when bullying peaks. This is the most difficult time to intervene as well. We evaluated a program called Second Step. The program included the research on risk and protective factors. It included very little on bullying, because what we've heard across the globe, kids know about bullying in most countries, if we've been talking to them for decades. And by middle school, they're talking about drama more than anything else. Rumor spreading, those types of things. This program also incorporated the latest brain research on how early adolescents learn. It also took a positive approach to problem behavior. For a long time, we had been pointing at kids, stop bullying. And that wasn't working. Here we want to understand how this program, too, it was fit to the early adolescents. Very different developmental period. Now, we've made a decision in our studies to have teachers, not psychologists, implementing the program. We do this because many of our teachers lack social-emotional learning skills. Our teachers are typically 22 years old when they start teaching. The brain is not developed until the age of 25. We find it important that those teachers administer the program so that they learn to improve their social-emotional competencies. So it was a fancy, fancy study, and I'm going to summarize it in one slide. We reduced physical aggression, bullying, cyberbullying, homophobic name-calling, and sexual harassment across the 3-year study. We had the best reductions when the teachers implemented with fidelity. That means they implemented the program as it was intended to be implemented. As you venture into doing this work, teachers will be reluctant. Some teachers will be reluctant to take this on. And their way of being reluctant is to not teach all the lessons. So if we can support them, that would be helpful. We then followed these kids into later years. And this is critical. So if you were in a second step school versus a control school where you got no social-emotional learning program, between the ages of 10 and 12, your school connectedness, your well-being increased over those 3 years. It then led to a reduction in all forms of aggression 3 years later. This was a 6-year study that showed that we reduced aggression simply by talking to kids about social-emotional learning, the very skills that help them academically, and here we showed socially. This was also the only study in the United States to include students with disabilities. If you are a student with a disability, largely ADHD, autism, behavioral disorders, and you are in a second step school, your bullying perpetration went down over the 3 years. Now, the last few slides, I want to talk to you about some new things that we're doing. As you recall, I showed you the meta-analysis where we were reducing bullying really well in the younger years, so ages 5 to 8. Still reducing it ages 9 and 10, and then nothing was working from 11 to 18. So we're rethinking. And we'll have to see how this fits into the Russian context. And this is happening globally, that we want to involve the youth. We started to talk to American children about why these programs weren't working. They find the programs not to be relevant to them. They don't find them engaging. They look like they were created by adults. and they're outdated. Some of them they're doing role plays. There's a curriculum notebook. So we started working with youth the last 4 years. And these are with students 15 to 18 years old. They want technology. They are very concerned about their own well-being and the well-being of their friends. They want resources for their friends. They want to impact their school climate. They say to us, the adults don't know what they're doing in the building. We don't trust the adults. We want to make our schools safer, but you can't do it as adults without us. So they helped us create what's called the Advocator. And this is a handheld, it's an application, if you will, app, where they can report both emotional and physical safety concerns to the adults. They can get resources for themselves. They can learn to do student campaigns. They can learn about restorative practices. They can learn about social-emotional learning. But the kids developed it with our tech company. It also, when they put a report in, the adults can't ignore it. Many kids said that they reported to adults, and the adults did nothing. They want to hold us accountable, and the Advocator is one way to do this. The Advocator, they can also report something positive. They can also report if a teacher's bullying someone as well. They wanted to make sure they could report a teacher or administrator. They also wanted to be able to promote positive things happening in their schools. That's one example of where we have to engage with the youth. Another example is we evaluate a program called Sources of Strength. Sources of Strength, again, for 15 to 18-year-olds. It's where we go in and we train peer leaders, the high school students, to be those change agents, to promote help seeking, to address well-being, to address school safety issues. They have faculty advisors, but it's driven by the peer leaders. They identify what they would like to address, what they would like to improve in their schools, and they run campaigns to do that. Has this worked? Absolutely. We've, with these studies, found an increase in the kids' connectedness to adults, an increase in school engagement, an increase of their perceptions positively of the adults in the building, increased well-being, decreased depression, and it's the only program where we've reduced suicidal ideation and reductions of all forms of aggression. Certainly let me know if you want more information about Sources of Strength. Last few slides, just to show you some future directions. We've talked a lot for decades about being trauma-informed, recognizing, at least in the United States, that 60% of our kids that are coming to school every day have experienced at least 3 traumatic events. And as opposed to saying, what's wrong with you when a kid acts out, you say, what happened to you? Simply flipping that, what's wrong with you, to what happened to you, you're starting to have a trauma-informed approach. So we're moving in that paradigm shift, and it's leading to improved student well-being. The other thing that we see internationally is when kids make mistakes and they engage in high rates of bullying, for the longest time, we kicked them out of school. We punished them. Remember, because we were thinking, what's wrong with you? Instead of what happened to you. Now we're thinking more of how do we restore some of the conflicts. So you'll hear restorative problem solving, you'll hear restorative justice, you'll hear restorative practices. As we have conflicts and hurts in our schools, as opposed to a Band-Aid, we want to open the discourse up to heal. Again, another completely separate field. So really, I think in the short time that I've had with you here, I have demonstrated that social-emotional learning programs have been very successful. We learned that our effects are strongest among the youngest kids, so we need to think about involving the older children, older students. So 3,000 articles later, we still have a lot of work to do. There's been some successes. We will probably never eradicate bullying, not in my lifetime. I am hopeful that we can reduce it by more than 20% in the coming years. I'm hopeful that when I come back to Russia, there'll be a lot more studies. Thank you very much.
Теперь у нас время для вопросов, которые можно задать профессору.
Now we have time for questions devoted to this topic. So who is ready?
Impressive and positive presentation, I will say, especially as I know that we are developing a lot of cell programs now, so we have this division to develop such programs. I have a lot of questions, but at least two I want to ask you. First of all, if I understand correctly, what we cell programs, we are not focusing on bullying prevention, we are focusing on developing social-emotional skills. And the second one is, I just realized how it's hard to, in a reliable and valid way, to measure aggressive behavior. What is the better way, what you are observing in your studies, to ask children about this, about bullying, about their experiences?
Okay, so the first question, absolutely. So social-emotional learning programs were not developed to prevent bullying. So when we teach SEL, or you call CEL, right? When we adapt it to bullying, then the examples, so if we're working on self-awareness, we may use examples of pure conflict or bullying, right? But certainly the outcomes are vast. I think we attempted to see if CEL was a possible avenue because we were failing in other domains. So that's also an interesting question too, because we have a study with small kids where we have one condition that's just CEL, and then a group of schools, another condition where it's CEL plus bullying prevention, and you don't need the bullying prevention. CEL worked just as well as the other two. Okay. The developer of the program did not like that finding, but that was the finding. Second question. The measurement of aggressive behavior is challenging. And I would say most researchers would say have multiple informants. So have the teacher report, parent report, which is very hard to get, and self-report. Teacher report, it depends on your school. right? So in our schools, in middle school, kids see 7 to 8 teachers a day. In elementary school, they see 1 teacher. So that 1 teacher could report. So it depends on the age, depends on the aggressive behaviors. Now the best way is to observe them. It's very expensive, right? We spend millions of dollars on playgrounds observing and in classrooms observing. And you've got to have trained coders that are reliable. Also, as much as we think bullying is rampant, it's still infrequent. So our coders sit there for 6 hours waiting for a bullying incident. They're sleeping. Excellent questions.
Да, пожалуйста, Елизавета.
Thank you very much for your really, really interesting and thought-provoking talk. I also have lots of questions, but I'm only going to ask one. In the beginning, you've mentioned that some countries succeeded, like Finland, and some countries have failed. But what do you mean by failing? And did they fail in the same way or in different ways?
Yeah, so let me talk to you about Finland's success. So they have the KIVA program, K-I-V-A, and they reduced bullying about 50 to 60% in their highly controlled evaluation. The minute the researchers went away, that went down, okay? That's just the fact. Also, what they have published, and even award-winning KIVA schools, they still have 4 chronically victimized kids in every classroom. Now, you can say 30 to 50% is a success, but what if one of those chronically victimized kids is your kid? Is that a success? And what is it like if you're one of those kids to walk into an award-winning KIVA school and you're still being victimized? Okay, so yeah. Some of us have made bullying increase. So we not only, that's what I was showing in the meta-analysis, we not only didn't prevent it, but we made it worse. But it really is an implementation issue. So many of our schools across the world, they want to check off that they've done bullying prevention. They bring in a speaker. They do an assembly that feels so good. And the meta-analysis show the assemblies make things worse. So it's making things worse. The other failure, we adopted in 1998 the Olveus Bullying Prevention Program. And it failed. Dan Olveus never published his US data out of South Carolina. And he finally said, it is really hard to implement in the United States. Not knowing enough about teacher education in Russia, I don't know where you would fall. In Finland, they're paid very well. They all have a master's degree. In the United States, not paid very well, don't have a master's degree. So when you say to Finnish teachers, please implement, they say, yes, okay. In the United States, they were like, maybe, you paying me, you feeding me? You have to figure out where you fall. In Finland, they respect teachers. In the United States, teachers are not respected. Lawyers are more respected than teachers.
Коллеги, еще вопрос. Надежда, пожалуйста.
Можно я задам на русском?
You were saying that it is important to work with families. And when a child is victimized, by bullying. The parents are making great efforts. They go to school and demand that everybody start working with this case. But when the child is bullied, then it's very difficult to speak to the parents. They say he wants to defend himself. How do you work with such parents and with such families?
Надежда, я тогда поработаю немного переводчиком, если вы не против. The question is that if you are a mother, for instance, of a child who is victimized at school, you feel really anxious about that. You go to school, you talk to teacher, to the principal, and you do much to change the situation because you're really anxious about that. So you're afraid that something bad in future might happen to a child who is bullied right now. But if you are a parent of a child who is bullied by himself or herself, for a teacher, it is really a huge challenge, a huge problem to make this parent, make this mother do something with the child, because the parent might say, the child is just defending himself or herself. There's nothing wrong, something wrong with other children. So what are the issues of the work with the parents of the bullies, not of the victims? Thank you.
Yeah, so this is really challenging. In the 25 years that I've done this work, I've had 4 parents admit that their child is a bully. 4. And about 17% of kids between the ages of 8 and 13 are bullies. So this is why in many countries we have punished the parents of the bullies when the parents don't do anything about it. This is why teachers and administrators, principals, kick kids out of the school. So there's no easy answer. If you're a parent of a child that's being victimized, I often ask parents, they call me, I say, can you move the child to a different school? If they say no, then we have a different strategy. If they say yes, it's worth a shot. It's worth trying. But as far as getting parents to recognize that their kid is the bully, $1 million question. We've tried punishing the parents, holding the parents accountable. What we're hoping, and none of that works. What we try to do now is to create schools and classrooms where maybe that child does something different. We all know that some kids have aggression problems at home, but if they come to a school where aggression is not tolerated, they will change their behavior. We call it code switching. Another example is when a mom comes to you and says, my child is out of control at home. And the teacher's like, she's wonderful here. So this is not deterministic. You're not going to fix that home environment. Let me tell you, you're not. But you can change the expectations for when that child comes into your school. And I've worked with some of these kids to say, that's not what we do here, and we want you to be part of the community, and we understand that that works at home with your brother or sister, but it's not going to be happening here. And that's the behavioral expectations. So we have the Positive Behavior Intervention Supports, or PBIS. And kids want to do the right thing. They do. They just need to know that what they do at home is not going to play out here. Excellent.
Спасибо. Еще вопросы? Да, вижу руку. Пожалуйста.
Здравствуйте, меня зовут Виктория.
My name is Victoria. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really very interesting, and I wanted to ask two questions. The first question. So the first question, the opportunity to get rid of bullying. Now you are saying that we can decrease the rate by 20%, but is it possible to eradicate this bullying? And the second question, how the teachers and parents are treating this event. Some of them think that it's normal that one person is victimized by a group of peers. And they say that it is impossible to eradicate it. So what's the position of teachers and parents, and how does it influence the attempts of reducing bullying?
That was Victoria, and she has two questions to you. The first one is that you said that you have declined bullying to 20%.
What is the possible figure, the possible percent, which might be higher? If we say that the total elimination is not possible, then how much? Yes, and the second question is, do teachers and people working at schools in the USA
How do they, what do they think about bullying in the, from the position that it might be kind of norm? It might be norm because in some communities and in the world of animals, if one person is bullied by many others, that might be just the right thing. It's normal. So do teachers usually treat it like this, or this is not a common position and somehow different?
First one. I got so excited by the second one.
The possible percent of the, how much can you decline bullying in school? Now you have 20%. Might it be higher?
Yeah, I think that 20% reflects across diverse studies. Certainly in some countries, they've seen 50 to 70%. Whether that's sustained is another question. Okay, to your second question, so yes, there is a body of literature in bullying that takes an evolutionary psychology approach and sees the behavior as adaptive. This is Patricia Hawley's work out of Kansas. I think she's in Texas now. And this is this idea that they use primates, right? So animals, hierarchical, who has power, who's the alpha. Teachers do not accept evolutionary perspectives in the United States. In some states, it's illegal to talk about evolution, meaning Texas. You cannot talk about evolution. If you're religious, then you don't believe in evolution, right? Because God created all of us in 7 days, right? So, but there's certainly a few scholars across the world that does see this behavior as adaptive, they view it from an animal model. They think about hierarchy structures in classrooms like they do with apes in a zoo. So yes, I can send you some of those articles. It's fascinating. There's very strong data to suggest this is the case. How do we disrupt those hierarchical structures? It's challenging because I think there's always going to be someone that's stronger, more powerful than another. Excellent question. I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. Brilliant.
Вопрос?
Спасибо.
Хорошо, да, один вопрос еще. Вот у нас нам подсказывают, что время уже заканчивается, но один вопрос еще можно задать, пожалуйста.
We have time for one question. I'd like to know the details, the mechanics of work with children's group. How would you work in specific case, if possible? This child's group where bullying takes place. And adults would like to reduce it. The families are open for such work. So the adults are speaking about bullying, but the situation persists. The victim, the child, the victim doesn't want pressure on the bullies because he wants to make friends with these children. And he said that if repressions take place or sanctions, then he will be in a worse situation. So how can we continue to work in this case?
So, okay, that's a good question. And it speaks to the complexity of this, that you can't simply just intervene at one level. You have to create schools and classrooms where bullying is not the norm. Okay, you have to be able to go in and create the climate such that the bully group is not the most popular. In order to do that, you first need to understand the phenomenon, right? So when we do our studies, we go and collect data and figure out who are the bullies in a school. Are they popular? Are they what we call influencers? So they're training other children. Are they the teachers? Without data, you're not going to be able to intervene. You can have one school right across from the other, and there's two different dynamics happening there. Also, we have what's called cohort effects. If you've ever taught, you'll hear from teachers in the United States, they'll say, that 7th grade group this year is the worst. We have cohort effects. In the United States right now, we have more bullying than ever because of the political climate. So it's going to, you can't intervene just in one way. And it's encouraging if the parents are talking, but if they don't understand what's happening with the kids, they'll have no success. 3,000 articles, and we still haven't gotten it right. 3,000 articles. It's because in some ways the kids maintain this behavior. This behavior works for kids that bully. And until this behavior doesn't work for them, we're never going to reduce it. We are human beings. We engage in behaviors that work for us. If I'm mean and cruel, and I get more friends, and I'm popular, why would I stop doing that? We have to create a society where that is not the norm. We have to create classrooms where teachers are so skillful that they can take a hierarchical structure and make it egalitarian. It's called the invisible hand. We know how to do that. It takes a lot of work. It is easier to throw our hands up. It's a great question.
Уважаемые коллеги, к сожалению...
Dear colleagues, unfortunately, so we don't have more time, unfortunately. I'd like to thank all those who have attended this session and like to thank Professor Aspelage. For us, it is a unique experience to communicate with a person who can tell us much how it works in practice and what we should implement in our country. Thank you very much, and we will see each other on the other session.